Hello, and welcome to Night Treks. The night is dark, so it's time for your tale. I'm Tom, your ghost host, and this is our strange journey into one story that is dark, strange, and true, but maybe not. So we'll leave that for you to decide. Well, tonight's tale, we have our ET, and Lewis Powell IV, who's also a historian at Troup County Historical Society and tour guide of Strange LaGrange in LaGrange, Georgia. If you've been watching this show, you know all that. You've probably seen him every time he's been on here. But we're glad Lewis is here, and he's going to tell us one of the stories from his tour. So tonight's tale is The Visiting Victims, as told by Lewis Powell IV.
This is the story that I tell standing right outside of City Hall here in downtown LaGrange, Georgia. The site of City Hall has been occupied uh, ever since 1830. In 1830, which was the same year that they constructed a courthouse up on the square, they built a jail building on this site. And originally, the jail faced Harrelson Avenue, which runs directly beside City Hall now. So this jail that they constructed was a wood frame building, and it really didn't last very long. It lasted for about 15 years. And then in 1845, it was replaced by a large brick building that was much stronger than the wood frame building that the county started out with. So it was in this building that a prisoner was held in 1877. This prisoner had been accused of a horrible murder that had taken place south of LaGrange in a community called Long Cane. The Long Cane community is located between LaGrange and West Point. And in 1877, it was a small but fairly prosperous community. In this community, there was a young couple by the name of Charlie and Amanda Miller. The Millers, and Mr. Miller was the son of one of the former sheriffs of Troup County, Thomas Compton Miller. The Millers had three young daughters, and their oldest child, I don't know her name, but we know the names of their two youngest daughters. One was 8-year old Rebecca, and then the youngest daughter was 2-year old Melvina. Now, as these little girls had grown up um, throughout the past few years, uh, Amanda Miller had started to notice there was this rather mysterious young man who had a tendency to hang around their house.
Mm.
And eventually, towards the end of 1877, she went out and decided one day to tell him off. And she told him, "You don't need to be coming around here anymore. I don't want to see you around here. I will have to summon the sheriff if I find you in my yard or around my house any further." So she made it very clear to this young man that he did not need to be hanging around the house. And she also made it clear to the neighbors and many of the other people in the community who all had begun to suspect that this young man was perhaps up to no good. So one afternoon in mid December 1877, Charlie and Amanda were off overseeing the local cotton gin. And while they were working, their young daughter went home. This is the oldest of their daughters. She went home to check on her two sisters, and she came back with a horrible story. While the two younger daughters had been at home, uh, this young man had showed up at their front door, made his way right through the front door, and as he entered the house, young Rebecca, who was 8 years old, stood up and she told him, "My mama says you're not supposed to be coming around here no more." And the young man says, "Well, that's no way to greet a fella." And so the little girl, who was feeling rather frightened, reached down and grabbed an iron fireplace poker, and she proceeds to hit the guy in the arm. Well, he grabs his arm out of pain and he turns around. And as he is turning back around towards the child, he happens to see a loaded shotgun propped up against the wall.
Hmm.
So he reaches over, grabs the shotgun, and turns around. And while the 8-year old child has her back turned, he fires two shots into her head.
Oh.
So after killing the little girl, he looks down and there is her 2-year old sister standing there with her
Mm.
mouth agape. So he picks up the iron fireplace poker and knocks the child down, leaps on top of her, and begins stabbing her in the chest.
Mm.
And a few moments later, covered in the blood of these two little girls, he calmly walks through the front door out into the yard and walks to the porch of a neighbor's house, where he takes a seat to watch the ensuing excitement. So the oldest daughter comes home, discovers the bodies of her two sisters, goes and runs and tells her parents what's been going on. So they come running home. And of course, everyone is hysterical. The community is thrust into an uproar. And immediately they begin to suspect this young man, Jack Thomason. So they look around for Jack Thomason. He's nowhere to be seen. And eventually they bring in the sheriff. The sheriff begins to investigate. And then 2 days later, they begin to make preparations for the funeral of these two little girls. So at the funeral, most of the community shows up to to see these two little girls laid to rest. And people in the crowd begin to notice that Jack Thomason is hanging around among the crowd.
Wow.
So someone in the crowd makes a suggestion. They say that there's this old superstition that says if a person is guilty of murder, if they lay their hands on the victim's body, then the wounds will begin to bleed afresh, and that will attest to the criminal's guilt. So they bring Jack Thomason forward and they bring him to the two pine caskets of these little girls. They pull the lids off the caskets and they have him lay his hands on the bodies of these two little girls. So he lays his hands on the bodies and the wounds don't begin to bleed afresh. However, everyone notices he is shaking like a leaf.
Mm.
And so the sheriff takes notice of this and he pulls Jack Thomason aside and he says, "I need to know, did you do it?" And Jack Thomason hangs his head and he says, "Yes, sir, I did."
Wow.
So he is arrested on the spot. He's taken to LaGrange, where he is incarcerated at the Troup County Jail, this large brick building on Harrelson Avenue. So they put him on trial. He is found guilty of murder and he is sentenced to hang at the old pauper farm. So The day of his execution arrives, and this is in June of 1878. It actually took several months for him to actually be executed once he was found guilty. So that June, he is finally put to death at the old pauper farm. And the LaGrange Reporter newspaper uh, has spends much of its column space on reporting the execution of Jack Thomason. But hidden in that article is a very interesting line. And this line says that after he was incarcerated in that jail, that he told a visitor that the spirits of those two little girls continued to appear to him every
Whoa.
night,
Wow.
and they would keep him awake by pulling the covers off of his bed.
Mm.
And he proceeded to tell the visitor that just a few nights before the day of his execution, the two little girls appeared to him again, and they said, "You're going to heaven. Your sins have been forgiven." And so Jack Thomason went to his death at the old pauper farm, knowing that he would go to heaven. And he
Wow.
made that statement on the gallows just before they put the noose around his neck.
Mm.
So the old jail building operated as a jail up until 1892. And after 1892, they constructed a new jail just off of the square nearby, and they moved the prisoners there. But the old jail stood for many more years until it was torn down in 1925. In 1926, they replaced the old jail with a very fine Beaux-Arts style city hall. And this building has served as LaGrange's city hall ever since.
Wow.
Now, I don't know if the spirits of the two little girls who appeared to Jack Thomason continue to appear in the city hall. Though I can tell you there is quite a bit of activity in this building. One of my favorite stories happened to a friend of mine just a few years ago. He works up on the third floor of City Hall, and one afternoon at the end of his day, he was leaving. He goes walking down the staircase that leads into the main lobby of the building. And if you descend that flight of stairs and you happen to look up as you're walking down the stairs, you will be looking down a hall that leads into the city manager's office. Now, my friend happened to know that on this particular day, the city manager and her staff were out of town on business. So as he's walking down the stairs, he glances up and sees disappearing around a corner into the office a figure wearing a long black robe. So my friend, who is a fan of a lot of these paranormal shows and paranormal videos, he was a little unnerved by what he saw, especially knowing that the city manager and her staff were out of town on business. No one should have been in that office. So he goes into the office of the HR department right across the hall, and he asks the young ladies there to accompany him across the hall to check out the city manager's office and make sure that the city manager and to make sure that nobody else was in that room.
Right.
And of course, they inspect the room and don't find anyone. But he has gone on to tell me that whenever he spends time in the building, usually after hours, usually after dark, that he frequently will hear disembodied footsteps. He'll hear
Wow.
voices from empty rooms. He'll hear the elevator going up and down on its own.
Wow.
And he's not the only employee at City Hall who has had those experiences. It turns out our city manager, our city accountant, um,
Wow.
even one of the major permit people, the head of the permitting department, I think, um, they have all had their own experiences in that building.
Wow.
So the city manager actually went on to tell me that she believes one of the spirits may be that of the former city manager who had served before her, and who had also been her mentor.
Wow.
And this gentleman was known to walk around with a pad of post it notes. And he would frequently leave post it notes just kind of in random places with funny
Yeah.
little sayings. And since his death some years ago, she has continued to find post it notes
Wow.
stuck up in random places in her office. There's nothing written on them, but she has continued to find these post it notes.
Wow.
In fact, she has come in several mornings knowing full well that no one is supposed to have been in her office, and she's come in to find post it notes scattered all over her desk.
Wow.
So she told me that she feels that it's definitely her mentor who is watching over her and making sure she's doing a good job for the city.
There you
But
go.
despite his spirit, there seem to be some other spirits that are a little creepier.
Mm.
Um, just several years ago, after the city hall went through a multi-million dollar renovation, once the staff began to move back in, one afternoon they were treated to the sound of a tremendous crash coming from the third floor. So a number of people went running up to the third floor to find out what had broken, and they discovered that a very large mirror had come off the wall in the men's room and broken in the middle of the floor.
Wow.
And most creepy was the fact that when they looked at the brackets that secured the mirror to the wall, the brackets were all still in place, and there was no reason that mirror should have come off the wall
Wow.
unless one of the spirits just thought it was hideous.
Wow.
So, even on my tours, I have had just a little bit of activity right around City Hall. Last year, on my very last tour of the season, I had a family standing at the back of the group, and they were really into picking up paranormal activity. They were taking pictures at
Right.
every stop, and as we were walking away from City Hall, they all turned back and looked. And in the central window above the front door of City Hall, they saw a figure walking back and forth uh, in front of that window and casting a shadow on the window, casting a silhouette. And they saw this figure just walking back and forth in front of the window. And they told me what they saw. And, we looked from our next stop to see if we could see anything,
Yeah.
but we couldn't actually see anything.
Wow.
And I haven't seen anything since. But I do know that the activity has continued at City Hall.
That is amazing.
Thank you.
So, oh, horrific, horrific story.
Mhm.
So, could they be connected? Could the spirits of the little girls still be there, roaming the hallways? Could they be affecting the other stuff going on?
I believe they very well could. And when I first came across the story of this murder, I was doing totally unrelated research
Wow.
and happened across this article. And when I read that line about Jack Thomason seeing the two little girls appearing to him, I thought, I've got to include this in my tour.
Oh yeah.
And so I do believe that there may be a connection. Um, There were at one point the police department actually had its offices on the basement level of the building. They did have some holding cells down there, but they actually had a jail that was located at that point right across the street. I happen to know about the holding cells because as a child, as a Boy Scout, we were taken on a tour of the police department,
Wow.
and I remember them locking us in one of the holding cells, all of these
Wow.
frightened little Cub Scouts. And I do remember that that was something that really kind of activated my anxiety. But
I'm sure.
but in the preceding years, they had built a new police department behind City Hall, and the basement has been freed up. It was used for storage for a long time, but they recently renovated the basement into more office space. And I have heard that many of the people in that basement tend to get really creepy feelings on a regular basis.
Mm.
And I suspect that perhaps that may have something to do with the old police department, but it could also be likely that the spirits of the two Miller children may still be in and around that building.
Sounds like it. And watchers, what do you think? Do you think that these two children, their spirits are still roaming the building? Do you think Thomason, was it Jack Thomason, is
Yes,
roaming the
sir.
building? Could he be the one they saw walk back and forth or by the windows? You know, who knows? And let me ask you this, watchers. What do you think about the spirits of the little girls coming to him before his execution? Could it have happened? Could it be real? Could he, I don't know your religious beliefs, but did he go to heaven after such horrific murders? Man, sounds like they forgave him, but I'm not sure the family did. So who knows? We'll leave all that for you to decide. So, well, now the tale is told and we are done. Thank you, Lewis. That was awesome.
Thank
So,
you.
until the next dark night when we take our night treks, this is your ghost host, Tom, and Lewis Powell the Fourth. May the force be with you, I guess I'm thinking. Wishing you safe and strange night treks. Night treks. Night treks. Night treks.